Hello buddy, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 multiplayer tier list. This time around we are going to be discussing the Venerable Vampire Counts. And this is a faction that, well, has gone through quite some change. Going from a nigh unstoppable juggernaut in the early days of Warhammer 2, and really quite so even in the days of Warhammer 1, to a much more weakened state nowadays, with consecutive nerfs to some of their strongest spells, as well as a lack of DLC and just a general limited playstyle and constricted by melee-only units, has kind of hamstrung the Vampire Counts a little bit, and definitely shapes the way their builds are generally created and the way the faction tends to play in many of its matchups. And it definitely helps shape which units are the dominant choices, whereas which ones are less common. So without further ado, we will be diving into the Vampire Count tier list. Of course, if you disagree with any of my choices, well, you're wrong, because my opinion is law. Just kidding. Of course, feel free to voice what you think down below. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. And if you've got any disagreements or any additional input you'd like to share, any units you think should be higher or lower, don't hesitate to mention it. Or if you think there's specific use cases that might be fun that I don't mention, obviously just feel free to share. I really do love hearing what you guys have to say. And without further ado, let's dive in with the Baldo himself, the man who ruined the old world, Manfred von Karstein. And he's strong. He's hella strong. That said, he's not going to get an S tier. I think he's still an A tier, even after all these years. Even after, not necessarily, he's never really gotten nerfs, but after, outside of course, the general nerfs to Lord Vampires. But even with the addition of other potent lords, he's still a very, very competitive choice. I think he's sort of like someone like Volkmar or Karl or Boris is, and definitely a very common and fairly, and unlike even Karl, I'd say a fairly reliable pick in most matchups. So he's going to get himself an A tier here. You can never really go wrong with him. The only lord in the game who actually has two full lords of magic to access, Lord of Death and Lord of Vampires, both very strong lords of magic. He has excellent winds of magic generation. Not the greatest fighter, but he does get access to Dragon, which is really the only thing that matters. Sure, he might not be able to slug it out in 1v1 versus, say, Kolek, but who cares when you've got a boatload of winds of magic to go with it. So very, very strong character. Easy A tier. You can put him in almost any build. Actually, you can even put him on a horseback. In certain matchups, I enjoy using him on a horse, for example, or on a Hellsteed. You can throw him fighting some chaff to charge up winds of magic with your Sword of Unholy Power, and then spam spells all day. And if your opponent doesn't do anything to zone you out, then yeah, they're kind of screwed, because you will have a spell spam comparable to some of the best spell spammers in the game. Moving on to Vladdy Daddy, Vlad von Karstein, Vlad the Chad over here, and he's good. He's gotten some buffs. I always kind of enjoyed Vlad. He was actually one of my favorite Vampire Count lords for quite a while, even though not necessarily the most competitive pick. But recently, there's of course been changes to knockback mechanics. He's gotten AP damage. He now causes terror, and he does have a reusable 66% ward save with the Karstein Ring, which is pretty bonkers. Now, he's certainly still a niche pick. He is still a foot character, and that is in and of itself a serious limiting factor, even with all the foot character buffs. However, due to Vampire Count's blobbery, and the fact that Vampire Counts often have a death ball, he ends up synergizing rather well with that. He can kind of stay in the death ball. Your opponent has to fight you at some point, and Vlad hits damn hard when you do. He's a very cheap terror-causing option as far as counts are concerned. Not the cheapest, though the fact that he's rolled up in your Lord does make him fairly cheap. I'm sure there's some cheaper combos. Krell, of course, is very cheap because Kemler himself is cheap. You can obviously use the aspect of Dread Knight, stuff like that. But as far as a Lord that's got terror wrapped up, he's definitely one of the strongest choices, or cheapest choices, I should say. And gets himself a nice B tier, I think. I enjoy using him against Empire, for example. He can eventually sort of grind through Empire state troops. Nowadays, he causes terror, which means you can rout that annoying rabble all the faster. And of course, with AP, he's a much more terrifying target. And of course, with the knockdown changes, he's a much more terrifying target if your opponent brought a Griffin Lord. If, say, Karl Franz tries to dive you, or Boris tries to dive you, he can smack him around a bit. Even smack around Volkmar, for example, that you might expect the Chariot to run roughshod over Vlad, but as long as you got some mild mass support, or really just don't get knocked over in the first time, you can oftentimes land some meaty hits on a character like Volkmar, which is pretty nice. I do enjoy me some Vlad. But certainly not an A-tier choice. Just the limitations of being on foot definitely hurts him. Moving on, I'd probably a low B tier. Probably a low B, high C. Definitely some personal bias. I just like using Vlad, guys. Moving on to Kemler. Kemler, I would say, is a high B. He's definitely, I would say, stronger than Vlad is, objectively. You get him on a horse. He's a fairly cheap caster lord. Has some decent AoE buffs. You've got the generic Necromancer AoE heal with Master of the Undead. And at the same time, though, you do have the Chaos Tomb Blade. So if you're trapped in melee or you're fighting in melee, you can provide that constant healing aura as well as extra melee attack to nearby units. So he's kind of constantly in it, supporting nearby troops. The Strider or the physical resist and magic damage that he now gets with the Cloak of Mist and Shadows is much more valuable now that he has a horse, makes him much harder to kill off. And of course, the Krell summon is still very potent. Krell lasts quite a while and hits like an absolute truck, an absolute champion character, even though he is a summon. And so I think that makes Kemler rather strong. That said, he is very squishy. He's definitely in our win condition. You can leave Kemler for last, and who really cares? He's not going to carry the game on his back the way someone even like Vlad can with terror and solid combat stats. He's not going to carry the game the way a dragon-mounted lord would, which many of these can. So he's certainly no win condition, but a very, very potent character and fairly resistant to sniping when used correctly, though you'd have to be wary of, say, fireballs and magic like that. Isabel Von Karstein is going to be, unfortunately, a D tier. I do enjoy me some Isabella. I do like playing her with some Banshees. But ultimately, she's just not very good. She gets the same point-and-click debuff as Vlad does. She does have the Chalice, the Blood Chalice of Bathory, which is great. She's got, I believe it's... forget which it is. I think it's Berserk Fury, something like that. It's her ability that increases a target unit's AP damage, which isn't bad. But ultimately, the Blood Chalice, it's a quick heal to your characters, but most of the Vampire Count characters heal on their own and do have fairly low HP pools. So unless you're running White Kings or Banshees, you don't have too much of a purpose in bringing the Blood Chalice. You do get some vigor back, but ultimately, Isabella and whatever character she's bringing do not have that high of HP pool. Basically get heal capped by a single use on each of the Blood Chalice of Bathory, which is kind of limits the utility of that item. And Isabella doesn't have any wins of magic generation. She doesn't cause terror, unlike her husbando over there. She's not an amazing caster. Not a particularly amazing fighter. Relatively tanky, but not quite as tanky as someone like, say, Vlad, or just the raw HP pool of a Dragon Lord. Ultimately, unfortunately, just gets a D tier. She's a very niche character that you might bring with, say, Banshees or White Kings, but ultimately, even there, you're usually better served bringing a separate or different character, bringing someone like Vlad or Manfred, or really just about any other Vampire Lord. I think she's unfortunately kind of the bottom of the barrel. We're all close to it. Moving on to Gorst and Helmim Gorst. I'm sure there might be some controversy on this, but I'm actually going to put him at C tier. I've actually gotten a whole new appreciation for Gorst, having played him more recently, and also with the steady cheapening he's gotten, and of course, some various higher end players have been experimenting with him more and more, and that's given me something to copy and get inspired by. And I found Gorst to be a rather solid pick in certain cases. He is still very snipeable. He is still very flimsy. Still dies very easily, and is arguably best used as essentially just a dirt cheap Mortise Engine. You basically just bring him, maybe with his item, the Liber Noctis, to get lots of wins of magic, and maybe don't even bother with spells. Just bring a Necromancer to do all your spellcasting for you. So it's a bit of an awkward usage of a Lord. He's still immobile. He's not really a win condition, though he can grind down infantry thanks to the Mortise Engine effect. So he's still certainly no champion of the people as far as just raw killing power goes. But I do think if you play him safe, or you play against factions that do not have the best ranged killing power, he can be a solid choice. He can slowly but surely whittle your opponent down. He's very cheap. You bring him alongside Necromancer, who you might have been bringing anyways. You get a dirt cheap Mortise Engine. And if your opponent wastes their time killing Gorst, who does have a decent-sized HP pool and some missile resist because he's a Lord, it does waste some time for them that they could be doing something to the rest of your army, which is actually going to be pretty big when you bring Gorst, just because of how cheap he is. Moving on to the Red Duke, a one-time staple of the Vampire Count roster. I think he's actually kind of fallen off, unfortunately, and I don't know if I would put him at C or D tier. I personally don't use him very often. I have seen him occasionally. I do see him still brought occasionally, but I don't think he's a supremely great pick. I think he just gets overshadowed right now by the Blood Dragon, and one of the big reasons for that is that his sole gimmick is El Sif, but the Blood Dragon gets Helm of Discord, and ultimately when push comes to shove, I think Helm of Discord is better. Now, I will put the Red Duke here under Gorst, actually, at C tier. I think he does have a niche if you want to go super hard in the paint for an aggressive melee Lord Snipe. He's not bad. He doesn't get the El Sif, which is nice. He can get a potion of strength, so he can smack somebody around pretty hard. But most of the time, for just supporting an army and for general usage, this guy's basically a low C and to D tier. But generally, you're going to be better off, much better off with the Blood Dragon, who brings Helm of Discord. And you're going to see this quite a bit here with Vampire Counts as we progress through this list. Certain characters are just a bit redundant and competing with others. And unfortunately, the Blood Dragon just kind of outcompetes the Red Duke. He actually supports the entire army with the Helm of Discord. He's got Heart Piercer, which can make your Blood Knights or Graveguard or Crypt Ghouls hit a lot harder. One time was actually nice synergy with Vargas, so now that they have AP, less so. He does have self buffs that make him fight much better when he's in sustained melee combat. All in all, just very, very solid character. Obviously, he's not a great spellcaster. That is a downside to him, and that is why he's tied in A tier with Manfred. I actually think I'd probably put him above Manfred. I think you see him more nowadays than you see Manfred, though that might just be my personal experience. I feel like I do see him more than Manfred. They're about the same, I would say, but both bring their unique sort of formula of powerful Lord set up to the table. But Blood Dragon, once again, you can bring him on foot, actually, just because he has so many effective support abilities. You've got Heart Piercer, you got Helm of Discord. He can actually be decent on a horse just to support some Blood Knights. I like taking him on a horse personally. You can bring him on a dragon to fight in the skies and dive down on targets of opportunity. Just a lot of ways to play him. I really do enjoy me some Blood Dragon. Easy A tier for him. Moving on to the Necrarch, this guy is, I would say, in my opinion, a low B tier, maybe high C. He's basically budget Manfred. There's really no two ways around it, which isn't a bad thing. He gets the lore passives for Lore of Beasts and Death, as well as, of course, Lore of Vampires. He gets some very, very nice Winds of Magic generation. He has some Lore of Death spells. You do get Spirit Leech, most importantly, which is nice. You do get a handful of Lore of Beasts spells, which I don't personally find super useful, but it is nice to have that option. And of course, you do get the most important death spells. You do still get Invocation of Neck. You do still get Raised Dead. And that does leave the Necrarch as a pretty powerful budget caster option. If you want someone who's still a decent combatant, who is still a vampire, even if a low stat vampire, he's got much lower stats, I believe, than I actually believe he has lower stats than the generic Vampire Lord off the top of my head. So he's definitely not a great fighter, but still, it's a vampire. He still has decent combat stats. He still gets AP on a dragon. He still hits like a truck on a dragon. Has lots of HP. And line all those things up, and you have a very, very potent Lord option. Now, obviously, he gets outshone a bit by Manfred, but he is a bit cheaper. So if you want a broader army, or perhaps you don't feel confident in getting good value out of your sort of unholy power with Manfred, and you don't think you're going to be able to get that much Winds of Magic generation, you feel you need to play safer, then the Karstein Lord is decent. Or perhaps you have some utility for some of those alternate Lord Beast spells. That can definitely be useful. Now, moving on to the Karstein Lord. Now, this bad boy, I think, has actually swung himself up. And this is more due to enemy buffs than his own virtue, I would say. But I think he's probably now sits close to an A tier. High B, low A. I'm not super fond of the Karstein Lord, but he definitely has a very important place due to his Storm of Midnight. So I'm probably going to put him at a low A. It's on the fence for me. I'd say either low A, high B, and you could argue for either. But this guy gets a bit of a blended lore once again, a bit of Lore of Beasts, a bit of Lore of Vampires. You do get a unique take on the transformation of Kadon, which spawns Vargolf. I personally do not find this spell super useful. It's kind of a pointless ability in my opinion. The Vargolf summon doesn't really last long enough to be that impactful, and unlike a Manticore, you can't just throw it at an optimal target as easily because it can get zoned out. It's a bound onto the ground, so it can be zoned out by chaff or enemy cavalry or whatever it may be. So it is a little limiting there. There's certainly still can have some cool usage. It can be nice to drop an extra Vargolf, an extra pair of paws on the ground to do some damage. But really, his main gimmick is Storm of Midnight. He's able to drop a Tempest in the sky when you're fighting aerial powerhouse factions, especially like the Wood Elves right now, or to a lesser extent like High Elves. You can risk it for the biscuit there. It can be a little difficult, but you can risk it there. It can be decent against the Vampire Coast, actually, if you fear that you might be facing Luther Harkon, who can otherwise be a major bully. Now, sure, Tempest is not ideal against Luther, who's got magic resist, but it can still do some hurt. And the Karstein Lord is not a pushover in melee. He's not amazing, but he is better than, say, the Necroarch. He can do some hurt and support a aerial fight fairly well. If he had a Manticore summon, I would actually say he'd be really strong, probably, because being able to put up an extra flying single entity for vampire counts would be nice, but sadly that is not the case. But a low A, high B for this guy. Moving on to the Lamian. Now, I love this lady. She's honestly probably my favorite Vampire Lord. The reason for that is because she does get it's got the Scepter of Stability, which allows you to get magic resist to a unit. I love the synergy that has with ethereal units. It's one of the few things, in my opinion, that can make them more viable. Otherwise, though, excellent spell selection. You've got Penumbral Pendulum. You have Enfeebling Foes, so some of the best lore of shadow magic in the game is on her. You've got, of course, your generic lore vampire spells. You've got Invocation of the Heck. You've got the Raise Dead. You do have Wind of Death, which is kind of useless, but you know what? Her spell selection is awesome. You get an awesome hybrid lord. Unfortunately, she doesn't have great Winds of Magic generation, but you can offset that with a Necromancer. And she has some great AoE debuffs. She can grant herself improved speed and ward save, but she can also debuff nearby enemies' melee attack and debuff their speed, which makes her very sneaky, makes her very slippery and hard to pin down, and can make her very good at supporting a massive engagement. Just all in all, I absolutely adore the Lamian Vampire Lord. I really like her synergy with Ethereals. I really like her combined or mixed lore magic. It is very, very strong, and she is, in my opinion, one of the stronger lords on the Vampire Count roster. Though, as you can see, I'm putting her down at the bottom here. I think I obviously have my bias, and I do enjoy running her more than most of these, if not all of these characters. I've always got a soft spot for Vlad, but I really do like my Lamian Lord. That said, I think objectively, she's just not quite as strong as the Blood Dragon or Manfred or Karstein. Certainly let me know what you guys have to say on that. Maybe I'm a bit wrong there, but I do think high B, low A would be fair. Now, the Strigoi Bloodline Lord, the last and final Bloodline character here. I enjoy this guy. I like using him a lot. I don't think he's the most competitive choice. Some wonky animations on foot leave him a little difficult to use there. He's very expensive and has very poor magic generation. Also, an awkward lore of magic. You basically have to bring a Necromancer with him to get zombie summons. So much like Gorst, except unlike Gorst, he's expensive. So I'm going to put him at a low B. He's a very strong combatant. He has the Claws of Morcane, which can make him hit like a truck. He's got a massive self-heal. And he has a Crypt Ghoul summon. Now, this is one that some people, I think, sleep on, but it's actually really strong. Against factions that have squishy backlines, or even factions that have squishy backline defense, it can be excellent to drop Crypt Ghouls on them and club them quickly. For example, you drop that on Slayers, and it's a good spell against Dwarves. It will mess up Slayers, it will mess up Rangers. You can drop it on Empire State Troops, they get mulched. Drop it on High Elf backlines, it can be decent, though obviously with High Elves, you probably want a more competitive aerial lord there. Against Bretonnian backlines, it could be decent. It can be decent for disrupting Skaven backlines. Crypt Ghouls will actually do quite a number on a lot of Skaven monsters too, just because of how low their armor is. So yeah, Crypt Ghouls got some gimmicks there. Crypt Ghouls are a fairly bursty unit, so they're not a bad summon. Usually you want your summon either to function as a cheap net, or body blocker, which is what zombies do, or you want your summon to have a very bursty design. It's why Gorst summon sucks, because Graveguard are all about grinding long term. So if they get dropped on a target and then they dissipate in a minute or two, they kind of miss their purpose. Whereas Crypt Ghouls are cheap, expendable, bursty infantry, so they actually have a use there, and I do enjoy them. Just a very expensive character there. You do still get Spirit Leech, you do get Gaze of Nagash, you can shotgun characters pretty well with that. Terra Geist mount, so decent combatant there. Bit iffy on foot, but it can be fun. So in all, I like this guy. I find him rather enjoyable to use. Definitely one of those off-meta-ish picks, but I think he gets himself a nice B tier. Moving on to the budget version, the OG DLC Strigoi Ghoul King, he gets himself a D tier. And I actually think I'm going to put him beneath Isabella because I feel like he really lacks a niche. He's basically just a cheaper version of the Strigoi Ghoul King, but the way these characters are designed, you really want this to be a heavy-duty fighter. You're investing a lot into these characters and into their support. So you better be getting something good as a reward, a very strong fighter. And I find that if I want a slightly cheaper fighter that's not quite as good, I will go for something else. And if I want what the Ghoul King offers, I'm going to cough up the full price, bring a full-blown Ghoul King, the Bloodline version. If the Bloodline version didn't exist, this guy would probably be sitting at a C tier or a B tier, but I just find that the two are so similar and near identical that there's really not much of a purpose to this guy. In my opinion, he's the loser of that comparison. You basically just bring him if you want a cheaper Lord. He does have the ability to buff a specific target's AP rather than just buffing his own AP by a bunch, which can have its niche buff uses, but personally, unfortunately, he just drops to D tier. He just has very, very little niche purposes. Like if you want a very cheap Strigoi or cheaper Strigoi Ghoul King, you'll bring this guy. But I find that the two are just too comparable and too similar to justify bringing him. Moving on to the generic Vampire Lord. Now this was one that I was actually surprised when I did my recent Fixing the Forgotten. I was of the opinion that this guy could use some tweaking and improvements to make him more competitive or make him more appealing. Many of you guys said no, and many of you guys have much more experience than I do with vampire counts and were of the opinion that he should be higher up. So I'm actually going to be putting him in C tier here. I think it is fair to say that he does have decent combat stats. He does have some decent combat items and is fairly cheap as far as vampires are concerned, and you still do get the lore vampires. So if you want a budget fighter, I don't think he's bad. I'm not sure where I would position him in C tier. I think that while maybe he's a more powerful Lord than, say, Gorst, he doesn't share the same niche. This guy shares the niche with a lot of these Vampire Lords who are already sitting at A tier. But he does offer a bigger cost advantage. So I'm going to put him at a low C tier here rather than a D tier. I don't think he deserves much more than that. I don't think you see him very often. Feel free to rectify me if that's not true, but I personally almost never see a Vampire Lord in action, and I don't run him very often myself. Outside of experiments, I don't really run him in serious builds. So I feel that he's not that common of a pick. I feel like he gets overshadowed by the other vampires for most part, but I do believe that he does have his niche, and I think it is ultimately a fair conclusion to say he should definitely not be a D or F tier. I think he's got his purpose. Necromancer, unfortunately, suffers from a similar issue to the Vampire Lord and the Ghoul King, redundancy. And we've gone through this before. I'm going to put the Necromancer at probably in between Isabella and the Ghoul King, though it's a bit arbitrary. I occasionally use it. I basically never use the Ghoul King because I just do not find him to be worthwhile for the slight cost benefit. I do occasionally use the Master Necromancer just for the fun of it and just because of how cheap he is. That said, if you want a cheap Lord, you're usually better off with Gorst or Kemler. This guy is just really, really cheap. Really, really cheap, and that's kind of it. But even not that cheap. But his main competition is Kemler. They're both very, very cheap caster options. Kemler's generally better, though this guy's just a little bit cheaper and a little bit crappier, like a lot crappier in melee, but a bit crappier overall. But you do lose out the Krell summon, which is pretty big, and you do lose out the extra survivability, but you can drop him on a Hellsteed. You've got a fairly mobile, flying, cheap Lord, which with Kemler you can't fly, so that does limit you a little bit. You can get sniped occasionally, which, I don't know. I do find that gives the Necromancer a tiny, tiny niche. I don't think he's worthy of the F tier, but definitely not great. Which finally gets us out of Lords, and holy heck, Vampire Count Lords are a friggin' chore. There's a lot of them, as you can see here. So, obviously, that is a domineering aspect to their roster, is the Lord selection. That is just how they be. But, yeah, there's a lot of them. So, moving on to heroes. Necromancer, for me, is somewhere between high A and maybe even S tier. Basically, you almost see him in every build, I feel. I'm going to put him at... I think I'm going to put him at a high A. If you're running any lower on Winds of Magic character, he's excellent just to get Forbidden Rod and spam Winds of Magic. He can make for a very, if you happen not, now granted, keep in mind Vampire Counts do have a very competitive hero slot. That said, if you happen to not want say double Crypt, I should say, maybe he does compete quite a bit with the Banshee and the Ghoul King. Maybe I'll move him down to A, but I still think he's a very stable A. Just in hindsight there, kind of debating it mentally, but he's got some great mount options, not for mobility really. He's stuck on a horse or on foot there, but you can put him on a corpse cart, which makes him actually a much more a corpse cart that can kind of fight in melee. Normal corpse carts have like 20 weapon strength, I believe, or 26 weapon strength, so unless you have some pro cycle charging, just kidding, even then they suck, but you get a couple hundred weapon strength. So you can do some damage in melee. You have some passable-ish melee stats, so you can kind of defend yourself in melee. And you do actually get the missile resist as well as Necromancer buffs for not too much more gold than a normal corpse cart. So can make for a very cool sort of super corpse cart. And otherwise, a great source of Winds of Magic. Great way to get your zombie summon if you're running a lord that doesn't have one. Great way to have a backup caster for the faction. Just cheap, cheerful, with efficient mount options. I shouldn't say great powerhouse options, but he has good mount options. Moving on to the Vampire, unfortunately, she is not particularly good. I will give the Vampire Lady, I think, a high D. I think she deserves more than Isabella and any of these three, but I don't think she's particularly good. You basically just bring these guys if you want a flying goon squad. That's kind of it. They're just too expensive for the fighting stats they bring to the table. Do not bring particularly good utility. They don't have great combat items. They don't really have great supporting items besides their own self-heal. And they don't really bring great spells to the table since you already have options to get Lord of Death and Shadows from other characters. So unfortunately, they net themselves a D tier. But they do have that niche purpose of if you're running a goon squad, you can justify them. Banshees, I do like much more. I think they are a fun and solid character. I'm going to give them a B tier. I think low B is fair. And I think Ghoul King sitting at probably another low A is fair too. It's a very competitive hero roster for the counts. Banshee, good at sniping models on low model count entities with her fairly decent weapon strength. She can, for example, snipe demigryphs. She can kill demigryph models with a single hit, which is nice. Fairly tanky against a lot of sources of damage, even against magic, just because she's a single entity, so there's not too much attacking her at once. She can do fairly well there. Very mobile at 60 speed, so not really a true foot character there. More like a Skaven assassin. Fairly cheap, very cheap source of terror. Does get the Wailing Banner, which synergizes very nicely with her own Fear and Terror. So you get extra -4 leadership passive. Yeah, just an all-in-all solid sniper assassin character. She can pressure enemy characters on a budget, and she can terror out a front line, and she can slowly but surely chip away at more elite troops. If you can get her on a unit like demigryphs, she will do amazing for her cost. If you can get her on a unit, like honestly, she can do okay against, say, a unit like a paladin or against some more elite, especially anti-large specialized characters. She will do rather well against. Just a very, very nice character in my opinion. And it gets a solid B tier. Once again, a very competitive tier though, and I do think she's, just because of how common magic missiles are and magic damage is against counts, I do think she's a bit limited there. Not the best combat stat. So for example, a Slann can actually crump her a bit, and if you see some magic missiles like Fireball or something, they will melt her fast. Hammer of Witches, for example, is her nightmare. White King, easy A tier. I'm sure some people would even consider him above the Necromancer. I personally consider him a little lower, but very, very solid character. Very tanky. Will eventually blend to front line. Okay fighter, certainly not a duelist, on par with, say, Paladin for the cost. They're both budget fighters, but I'd say this guy's worse than, say, Paladin for that price tier. But a decent enough fighter, very, very beefy, has lots of armor, lots of HP, lots of silver shield. Can be thrown on a horse for added mobility, and gets the Scab's Wrath, which is really the main selling point. You throw him in a front line where he's grinding, and then he melts some Bretonnian peasant archers or whatever with the Scab's Wrath cast, which, yeah, is one of this guy's big selling points. It's just that he can mow down cheap, lightly armored infantry with Scab's Wrath. So easy A tier for this guy, just decent overall character. Kind of the equivalent of a Paladin, but instead of being against large and providing Guardian, he is against infantry and provides Scab's Wrath. Which does move us on to infantry. Now, Zombos might be surprised. I'm going to move them up a little bit. I'm personally not as big of a fan as some others are. Zombies are obviously dirt cheap, but they are very slow, and they slow your entire army down to their speed unless your army is composed of Gorst and a horde of corpse carts. This is something I don't appreciate a huge amount. It makes you more kiteable and makes it difficult to get a full sort of synergized engagement going because everything is faster. So unfortunately, they do get a low B here. I can obviously see the argument that they're A or even S because they are cheap, but I really do not like the speed on zombies. The fact that they are so slow does make it a bit hard, in my opinion, to get that ideal engagement. And so they are brought as filler. They are very cheap. You can bring 5 units of them for 500 gold, just like peasants for Bretonnia, but I do not consider them as optimal as Bretonian peasants just because of that slowness. And I think I'm going to give them a B tier here. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with that. That might be my most controversial choice on this list. I'm not even sure, but I just personally am not a fan of that bad speed. It's a killer for me. But excellent tar pit, of course, and just dirt cheap zoning tool. They don't break, so you can't expect to blitz through them quickly, and they'll just eat up damage for days. So honestly, pretty good for that. I'll give them a high B, but no further. Skeleton Swords, definitely not an ideal unit. Probably a low D, maybe against factions where you're expecting to fight a lot of infantry, like Coast. Maybe against, I wouldn't even say against Tomb Kings, because Realm of Souls will mess these guys, will let the Tomb King Skeletons outdo them. Not in a mirror matchup where I think Graveguard is better. Generally, Graveguard and even Crypt Ghouls kind of outshine these guys if you really want to deal with infantry. And if you want a tar pit, you're going to bring Skeleton Spears or Zombies. So I'm going to give them a very low D tier. I think maybe against Dwarves and Coast, they're okay. You can maybe argue for them against, say, Empire or Bretonnia, where you just want to go a little wider and want something that'll beat down the very cheap trash troops like Men-at-Arms or Peasants, but really not a unit deserving much more than that in my book. And honestly, you can make this argument for these guys being F tier and just not really usable. Which does bring us on to Skelly Spears. I think these guys are a rather staple pick. I will give them a B tier. I think they've fallen off a bit in usage as of late. Might be due to the increases in costs to certain vampire count units. For example, the Terra Geist and Graveguard, of course, have gone up in cost. Obviously, with better combat performance to compensate, but those price increases have reflected in what units you can afford to bring elsewhere. And so, obviously, Spears have fallen a little bit by the wayside. Still the best or the strongest, I would say, unit you want to invest in if you just want to hold as counts, because everything else here is just too expensive or not as good. Will leave a little bit of a dent in some large. If you're expecting especially flimsier or squishier large, they will do a decent job. Great against, say, Beastmen, decent against Bretonnia. They'll just grind and grind and grind and jab at those horses. Certainly don't expect them to win against anything in their price range, but solid, unbreakable spear unit. What can I say? Crypt Ghouls. Not a huge fan of these guys. I think they've got a few niches here and there against Vampire Coast, against Tomb Kings. I think high D to low C is the best I'd put them. They can be decent in a rush or as a surprise pick. I personally still think they could use something a little more, maybe a little more speed or something. But for me, they're going to get themselves a C tier. And yeah, they're just not particularly great in my book. But they can be a bit of a surprise pick. They will club down cheap chaff. So against Tomb Kings, Empire, a little bit against Bretonnia if you want to risk it. Vampire Coast, of course, they can perform. Just got to watch out for guns. But they are cheap enough where missile fire against them can be a bit squandered, since there's other more expensive targets on your roster that are probably drawing enemy attention. Moving on to Graveguard, an excellent unit in my opinion, and still very much a staple pick. In my opinion, Graveguard, I would probably still personally consider them an A tier. I do really like Graveguard. I'm going to give them B, high B. Very good unit. Hit like a truck. Hit great against infantry, obviously. Not so good against any large. Pretty terrible there, but hit very hard against infantry, silver shields, high HP pool, good armor. Slow, but who cares? They'll basically trade very, very well at their price point. Easy B tier for me. You'll see them in a lot of builds. Even just 1 or 2 units of Graveguard thrown in can be very valuable, though you'll oftentimes see the Sternsman thrown in instead. But I think these guys do net themselves a nice, easy B tier. Fairly reliable and fairly consistent unit you will see a lot. Much like zombies. Maybe I should put the zombies at a low A, because you basically see zombies in every matchup, but I don't necessarily think that that's great with every build. And I think there is competition to an extent with certain build types. But if you wanted to go for a narrower count build, they can be not the best. But I'll give them an A. But yeah, I think Graveguard's a very, very stable pick. Cairn Wraiths, another unit that kind of sits in my mind with Crypt Ghouls in being a fairly low usefulness unit, but with its niche purposes, it's a very cheap source of terror. It's a very mobile unit, has AP. Nowadays, okay-ish combat stats. They have splash attacks, which is interesting. One of the few units that actually suffers from crumbling because their HP is so low. I'm going to give them a C tier. I think I'm actually going to put them above Crypt Ghouls because I do like using these guys in more builds than Crypt Ghouls. I like their mobility. I like their terror. And there's some matchups where you do want the AP, but I don't really want Graveguard. Especially if I'm expecting AP monsters, for example, the Graveguard will be much squishier than, say, Cairn Wraiths. If you're not expecting too much magic, the Cairn Wraiths can be decent. But it is very niche, and you are kind of counting on your opponent being a faction that doesn't have huge access to magic. Which does move us on to Graveguard with Great Weapons, another unit I think is actually a lot better nowadays than it used to be. I'm going to give it a very low B. They hit like an absolute beast. So if you bring a Van Hell's Dance Macabre, or you got a Corpse Cart nearby to offset those trash sustained combat stats, they will beat down anything. I actually like bringing them against Lizardmen. They're solid against Dwarves. They're solid against Empire, actually. They can contribute a bit to that heavy cav fight, and because they have such high weapon strength and it's AP. Even though their melee attack isn't the best, but you throw in a Van Hell's Dance Macabre and these guys will hit. And you can throw them in against some elf factions. I think against high elves you can sometimes utilize these guys, leverage them a bit. You can leverage them in certain builds against chaos. Definitely not a unit you will see in every matchup, but a unit you can make use of in several, I would say, matchups. Probably a good third, probably a good 5 or 6 matchups. You can make decent use of these guys, and I think that warrants them a low B, high C tier. The Tithe is a unit I'm very not fond of. I actually almost consider this an F tier unit, unless you just happen to have money left over, because you pay double zombie cost for a unit that is not worth 2 zombies. It only covers 1 area instead of 2. It only gets 25% more models, and a little bit of physical resist. So really, this unit is kind of too expensive for what it does. Either zombies honestly are too cheap for what they do, but this unit's just too expensive for what it does relative to them. So in my opinion, very low D tier. Unless you happen to have no money left to spend on anything else, and you just want 5 zombies, you just don't have the cash to spend. I don't see the point in bringing these guys. It's just always better, in my opinion, to bring 2 zombies instead of 1 Tithe. Unless you've hit your zombie cap and you don't have money left over. So they get a really low D tier there. I guess it can happen just because it's only 100 gold we're talking about, but it is double the cost, so something to keep in mind. Kunistein Stalkers, I like them, but I do think they've fallen off a bit nowadays. They're definitely your budget Graveguard option. I think if you want some cheap source of poison damage in melee as counts, you're more often going to see Crypt Ghouls, Crypt Horrors, or the Crypt Ghoul Regiment of Renown. And the Kunistein Stalkers, that's one of their big selling points, is that they're essentially budget Graveguard with poison. So unfortunately, I'm going to give them a high D tier. I think that they can be decent in some matchups as support for a Graveguard build if you just don't happen to have the money for Graveguard, but you don't want to go with squishy infantry. Like, you might be facing an enemy who does a pretty good job against Cairn Wraiths or does a pretty good job against Crypt Ghouls. In that case, yeah, go for Kunistein Stalkers. They are a bit tankier. They've got shields. They've got poison damage. They've got 60 armor. And okay, though certainly not amazing combat stats. D tier unit, in my opinion. They've got those niche use cases. But unfortunately, I just don't see them very often. I myself have kind of fallen out of favor of using these guys. outside of a handful of narrow builds where I just want to bring one more elite infantry, and I can't afford more Graveguard. Which is bringing me on to Regiment Renowned Crypt Ghouls. I adore these guys. Easy A tier for me. Mobile, stock, Vanguard, basically everything that Crypt Ghouls struggle with, being flimsy and easy to shoot up, these guys negate by getting up in your face and flanking and spanking. Very cheap for what they do. They are great in almost every matchup, in my opinion, just because of how well they mulch squishy infantry. So even if you don't, as long as you get the jump on your opponent, don't get sort of Vanguard them in a back corner and get clobbered by heavy cav or something. As long as you're smart with your vanguarding or smart with your positioning, these guys can always find a use. It doesn't matter what matchup it is, in my opinion. I'd say there's even an argument for these guys being an S tier because you can basically find a use case versus every faction for these guys, I would think. Except like even high elves, these guys will beat down spears, for example. It's just that they are squishy. They are a bit unforgiving. They can get sort of run down by heavy cav. And if your opponent brought, say, a lot of heavy cav and you get it jumped on, it can end very badly. I've had that happen to me in tournament scenarios where I vanguarded these guys, got spotted because the map was smaller than I'd thought. And yeah, these guys got run over and instantly money down the drain. So a little unforgiving there. Well, I'm not going to give them an quite a S tier, but I'm going to give them, I think, a very high A. I actually really love these guys. They suit my playstyle a lot, and I think you can make use of them in almost every, if not every, matchup. Sternsmen, very solid. If you're going to bring one Graveguard, you're going to bring the Sternsmen, in my opinion. Easy high B tier. You don't bring Graveguard every time. They've become a little bit less meta with their cost increase, in my opinion, but still high B for Sternsmen. If you're going to bring any Sterns, if you're going to bring any, I should say, Graveguard, even if it's just one, you will bring the Sternsmen. Regen, incredible combat stats for the cost, especially for Vampire Counts. Good leadership. They don't really crumble. Yeah, they're great. Easy B tier. Good unit, souped up to a good Regiment of Renown. I really do like me some Sternsmen, and I think they deserve that place as a high B tier, and probably the highest B tier here. Moving on to heavy cavalry. Now, this is going to be a bit of a oddball category here. Some of these units have perhaps fallen off a bit in favor. Black Knights, I think, are a respectable unit. I'd probably position them... You see them quite a lot. You see Black Knights quite a lot. I would probably position them at a high B. I don't know if I'd position them above these characters. The characters are kind of their own entity, almost separating the normal units. But yeah, I do think I'd probably bring them more often than that. Most of these guys, except maybe Kemler. I think Black Knights are even... Black Knights are good. They're fast. They hit hard against infantry, which is what they're meant for. They're really there to disrupt any backlines. They're not really flimsy enough, though, to be run off by heavy cav quickly. And they can outrun a lot of the heavy cav that would otherwise counter them. The over-specialization and fairly low charge bonus does limit them a little bit. It means they're not super good against enemy cavalry, and does make this unit a little lower on the list than it otherwise would be. Just the hyper-specialization is definitely something that hurts them. But they will still trade okay with non-AP, especially lightly armored non-AP cav. They've got solid sustained combat stats. They've got respectable armor, respectable mobility. All in all, I think a solid B tier unit. You'll see them probably a little... I don't know. I feel like I see them more than I see Skeleton Spears nowadays, so that's why I'm giving them a B tier. But I think they're very solid. In most matchups, you can throw in one or two to disrupt the backline, and it won't hurt you at all. Lances and Barding, unfortunately, can't say the same for them. If you have excellent micro and you're a really good player, not me, they can pull off some tricks. They're probably a little bit overpriced or otherwise understated in sustained melee for the performance they bring, or however you want to see it. But they take a lot of micro to make use out of, and generally they're trapped in an ugly spot between Blood Knights and Black Knights, where either you want to go whole hog and have a hard counter to heavy cav and enemy large with Blood Knights, or you want to go super budget and disrupt backlines with normal Black Knights. So unfortunately, these guys net themselves a D tier, probably a low end D tier. I'll probably put them beneath Necromancer here, because I feel like you see them very, very rarely. Maybe I don't know, somewhere around here. They can be good against a handful of factions. I think against Beastmen, though Blood Knights are such a good bully cav against Beastmen that these guys get overwhelmed even there, and what should otherwise be a good matchup for them. Against Skaven, it can be good to throw one or two of these guys in because they will just decimate those ratties on the charge. But yeah, D tier on these guys. There's just basically, if you don't have money left over, but you really want another heavy cav, and you happen to have a little more money than for Black Knights, yeah, maybe you'll squeeze these guys in, but it's really an oddball pick. And even their best matchups, you're usually going to bring Black Knights plus Blood Knights rather than, say, double Black Knights with Lances and Barding. Hex Wraiths, a unit I really want to enjoy, but honestly do not think are particularly good right now. They can be decent against, say, even decent might be a stretch. The main problem is that Chill Geists basically do their job better, a lot better, and so, and you don't want to bring too many ethereal units because it is a big risk. So unless you're going for a full Mimi ethereal build, you're not going to bring them. They can be good against Beastmen. Maybe I'll put them at a... I'm going to put them in a D. They are anticipated, and usually you'll see Chill Guys before these guys. So they can be good against Beastmen. Some of the matchups where you would think they could be okay, just because they have magic damage, for example, or the physical resist could help in some peripheral fights, or whatever the case may be, they tend to find opponents that have, well, some... either magic damage baked in, or you get weird resistances to their fire damage. So against Wood Elves, Bretonnia, High Elves, they're, in my opinion, pretty terrible cap choices. They can do okay against, say, Greenskins or Empire, even if you're good on your micro. They can do okay against Empire. They can do Greenskins, Beastmen. Okay against Dwarves if you're... Once again, if you're on top of your micro. Actually, not a terrible unit, I will say this, against Coast. Coast does not have good magic damage options, besides Sirens, who are themselves ethereal and thus get dumpstered by Hex Wraiths, especially on the charge. Sirens just get annihilated. Besides Sirens and Spiteful Shot, and I guess Artillery if it happens to hit, but usually you won't see Carronades, many if any Carronades. Vampire Coast doesn't have great counters to Hex Wraiths, which makes Hex Wraiths really shine there. Can be okay-ish in that matchup, so or good in that matchup, I should say. So there's a few matchups where you shine, but I think generally you'll bring Carronades instead, just because they're cheaper and less risky, get more area coverage, and you don't want to commit to full ethereal. It's more of sort of a win condition if you happen to get lucky or your opponent isn't able to focus them down. And so over-investing in that with Hex Wraiths is a bit difficult. So I think high D tier, but they do have their niche and they can shine if used correctly. But Chill Geists, as we'll get to soon, tend to outshine them. Blood Knights, in my opinion, I'm going to put them in S tier because I'm a Cavalry nut. I love Cavalry. I use the hell out of Cavalry. Obviously, they suck against Dwarves, but that's probably their sole bad matchup where you really don't want these guys. You can make a case, I think, in just about every matchup for these bad boys. The only exception is Dwarves. So, yeah, S tier for Blood Knights. I love them. They crush every other large or every other cavalry in the game. They do pretty well against any source of large. They can cycle charge in the infantry to death if you're on top of your micro. Obviously, you got to be on top of your micro. They can be more difficult to use than Dragons and Terra Geist and Mortise Engines just because they don't reward sort of brain-dead blob and click as well. But very valuable in most, if not all, matchups. And I think for me, really most, I should say, because Dwarves, obviously, they're not. But easy S tier for me. Very, very good unit. And I do think they're the first tier deserving an S tier. I'm sure some people think Zombies should have gotten S tier. Maybe the Necromancer. I'm sure there's other cases to be made here. But Blood Knights, for me, are the S tier. Varex Reavers, Black Knights with Lances and Barding, made decent. Still a very niche unit, but the fact that they have regen means and passable combat stats with Vet 9 makes them a much more decent niche unit. I think they sit comfortably in C tier, maybe a little lower than these guys. Honestly, it doesn't. All of this is kind of evenish. These are all niche units. You can field in a decent amount of matchups. Varex Reavers. Yeah, they're 400 cheaper than Blood Knights. They can self-sustain, so you don't have to worry about dropping Invocations on heck on them all the time. They're not as expensive, so you don't care as much if they're getting focused like Blood Knights. It frees up space for 4 zombies, for example. If you're fighting Coast, you can get 4 extra zombies on the field, or 4 zombies if you bring Black Knights with Lances or the Varex Reavers. If you're fighting against Skaven, it gives you more swarming ability. You can even get like skeleton swords and a zombie for the price that for the money you saved on getting Blood Knights with these guys. And their combat stats are still decent enough against large. They're still decent enough against soft, squishy, large targets. So for me, C tier, still not an excellent unit. Still tend to get overshadowed by Blood Knights or their much cheaper Black Knight cousins, but I think they've got their niche purposes, and I think C tier is very fair, maybe even a high C tier, depending on who you are and how you play. Chill Geists, on the other hand, are a really good unit. If you're going to bring one ethereal, odds are it is going to be the Chill Geists. I think they net an easy B tier. It's just a question of where they land on B tier. I actually probably would put them above the Black Knights. For me, they might even be above Graveguard. I really like these guys. Great against Empire. They don't do fire damage, which actually kind of helps against factions who have weird fire resistances baked in, like High Elves. Though still, you don't really want to bring them against those factions. But it helps against Dwarves, for example, because they can escape Slayers better. But not just that. They can also counteract Iron Drakes better. One of the weird things people forget is that Iron Drakes have both magic and fire resist, which makes them very resistant to normal Hex Rays. It means Hex Rays basically do fuck all against them. Chill Geists counter that by just doing magic damage. So very, very pleasant unit there. They have decent combat stats, so they're a worthy unit to drop, say, Cetro Stability on, keep them in the fray. Beat down, I'm pretty sure, most, if not all, non-magic cav in the game. So very, very strong unit. I think the only units that might beat them are maybe... I'm pretty sure they beat the Royal Uplift Griffites. Not sure if they beat... Obviously, they lose to Grail Knights, unsurprisingly, but I think they might beat both the Companions of Canel and Blood Knights, and maybe the ROR Dragon Princes. I'm not entirely sure. Or they perform very well against them. So you get this very powerful combat cav that moves like insanely fast, 94 speed, has a chilling aura, combo it with the Dire Pack, and you've basically got an instant death sentence for any skirmish cav that got caught. Cause Terror, just a great unit overall. Moving on to the beasts and flyers of the roster, Bats. And Bats for me are probably another S tier unit. You will see them in almost every Vampire Count build. Excellent backline disruption. Good aerial fight disruption if you're not facing Tempest. If you face Tempest, these guys are just going to control deleted. They're basically useless. Especially now that there's a max cap of 5 on flyers. That hurts these guys a lot. Makes them far, far less usable against, say, High Elves. Because High Elves can just catch them in the Tempest and you're screwed. And you basically it's 250 gold down the drain. But and obviously they're not going to focus just them with the Tempest, but to get your good air engagement, you want your Bats supporting your big flyers. And if those Bats get caught, they just get mulched. So, poor Bats. S tier or S tier. Great for zoning skirmishers, great for zoning enemy foot skirmishers, flying air units, great for chasing gyrocopters, pressuring backlines, disrupting enemy cav charges. Actually, if you don't have a summoner with zombies on the spot, you can disrupt a cav charge with Bats, kind of like you would with Harpies. Just overall solid unit. Just doesn't do any damage, but they're basically a flying tarpit, and good for it. Direwolves, much less useful, though still not a terrible unit. Biggest downside of these guys is their terrible leadership and relatively high cost, so they crumble very, very easily and die quickly. But they're not quite as throwaway as Bats because they're cost 500 instead of 350. So for me, Direwolves are probably going to net themselves a C tier. I like to use them quite a bit just because I tend to play in a very cavalry heavy playstyle, so I don't make as much use of Bats. Though Bats can be once again useful for disrupting charges. But Direwolves do net themselves a C in my book. I'd probably give them a low C, but especially when taken objectively, because they are just so flimsy and tend to fall apart. But they can be a very strong disruptive presence. They can do a decent chunk of damage, and the fact they don't rout makes them very hard to shake off. If they get on top of, say, an artillery crew, you cannot just drop Boris Todbringer on them and they will run off the field the way dogs will, or Skaven Wolfrats will. Skaven Wolfrats charge something and it does terror, yeah, they're running off for the hills. Not these bad boys, not these disgusting doggos. They will stick around to the bitter end. So these good boys, once they chomp, they're going to stay chomping until they're dead. So that can be good if you're on top of your micro and keep them alive, or able to micro in and out of a fight. And then they can be useful. But once they start crumbling, they tend to crumble to oblivion because their HP and leadership is so bad. Kryptors, a unit that I do not personally utilize very much, and I'm not very fond of. but has its uses. For me, it's going to be another high D. I'm not fond of Cryptars outside of themed builds. Very low weapon strength and very low armor, double up to, and fairly low combat stats, really triples up to give a unit that doesn't. They're a low C, high D, but delivers a unit that just isn't amazing. They can grind okay because they do have poison, so they will debuff whatever they're fighting down quite a bit. So that 70 weapon strength isn't as much of a disadvantage. If that monster's infantry unit, if those trolls you're fighting went from 100 weapon strength down to 75 because you hit them with poison, suddenly you're much more comparable. But the combat stats are still terrible. The armor is still god-awful, and ultimately there's better ways, in my opinion, to build your roster with vampire counts. If you need to crush enemy infantry, Graveguard or Chariots are probably a better way to go. If you're going for something wide and swarmy, then these guys are just too slow to really support a lot of cavalry and monsters and flyers. So, not a huge fan. They can do okay with a Mortise Engine, and they can act as a sort of fallback point where they body block enemies trying to pursue a lord or character. But ultimately, I'd rather have a different unit body blocking. I'd rather have some Blood Knights for that job, or rather have some Vargas even, or Doggos or Terra Geist or something like that, than or zombie summons really, than Cryptars. So unfortunately, they net themselves a D. But they do have their niche purposes. I do occasionally use them in some builds, but not much. Vargas, another one that you guys were quick to correct me on fixing the Forgotten. I don't think they're an amazing unit still, despite their buffs, but I do see where some of the comments were coming up from in regards to their AP damage. They definitely do hit like trucks, and so if you get a nice meaty engagement, if you've netted your opponent down to zombies or bats, or you need to win air supremacy once again against a faction that doesn't have Tempest, these guys are excellent. They hit really hard. They got AP. They have fairly good offensive combat stats. And if you provide them with some healing support, they'll tank through at least a little bit. So I think I'll give them, but they are incredibly unforgiving, and that's the main reason I'm going to keep them fairly low. They can be fun in some mass flyer builds. That's the main place I've personally used them. And so I'm going to put them at a fairly low C tier. I think their squishiness is still a major downside. You don't really want them against factions with Tempest, which limits their usage as an air powerhouse. But against a handful of heavy cap factions, especially against someone like Empire, they can be decent. If against Coast, they can be okay just because they tear through zombie gunnery mobs pretty quick. And they can help against Luther Harkon in the air fight. So C tier for them. I think they're solid in some cases, but I personally don't think they're quite. I think they're just very unforgiving is what it comes down to. It's kind of like Direwolves. They just die very easily. And if you're not on top of your micro, you won't necessarily get your money's worth. Though it's less bad than, say, Black Knights with Lance and Barding, whose stats are so bad that if you have bad micro, they will very much not pay for themselves. Vargolf, an excellent unit. In my mind, easy low A. Hypermobile, hits not super hard, but hits fast. Regens, causes terror, is fairly cheap for that. Solid combat stats, good bully unit. You bring 2 of these guys, 3 of these guys, you can really take somebody to Pound Town, focus a single target, and beat the crap out of them. One-on-one, not the best combat unit by any stretch of the imagination. Really not great in sustained combat because of that very bad armor, but and of course they are susceptible to fire damage because of regen, but ultimately very, very strong unit. If microed well, can do excellent work. Good for supporting Cav as well. You throw this guy on top of some Blood Knights and he's giving you a constant stream of AP damage on top of Terror. So really, really solid unit, and he can keep up because you got 82 speed on this guy. Terra Geist became much more of a dragon, and actually probably gets the S tier here. I think if there's any unit, I think he's probably better than the Blood Knights, even though both are very good. I think Terra Geist is probably something you see more often. A little more forgiving, being a single entity, has regen, great anti-single entity breath attacks, causes terror, has much better combat stats against infantry than it used to. Back in the day, this bad boy had a grand total of 26 melee attack versus infantry, which meant that, yeah, if you got stuck fighting decent infantry, this guy got clobbered. Nowadays, he got 36, so if you get stuck fighting infantry, you'll still get clobbered, but not as easily and not by quite such bad infantry. So, it's an improvement. Terra Geist ain't bad, fairly tanky. 80 armor is not bad, solid HP pool, regens, blah, blah, blah. Very good unit. You've probably seen them in a bajillion matchups, except dwarves. I think Terra Geists are basically good everywhere. And you can make use of them just about everywhere. So, yeah, really, really good unit. Easy S tier for me. Dire Pack, another excellent unit, in my opinion. Easy A. For me, they'd probably be an S tier. I use them in a lot of builds, so, but against except dwarves. But great combo with Chill Geist, as mentioned before. Great combo with Blood Knights. They can disrupt the charge. They can catch enemy skirmish cav, especially if it's slow skirmish cav like Outriders. They'll tear them a new one, get them on skirmish units, or say Salamander hunting packs, and they will tear them a new one. They will do a serious dent. They will leave a serious dent even in well-armored heavy cav just because of how high their bonus versus large is at 14. Not quite as strong tit for tat as the Norskin bonus versus large hounds, as the Beasts of Tashnar, but unbreakable because they're undead. And only 150 more expensive than Direwolves. Very, very strong unit. Just excellent at demolishing large units. And for example, these guys can be dangerous for, say, dragons and phoenixes. If those units land on the ground, they don't have that much armor. You're talking only 30 to 80 armor on a lot of these flyers. Everything from, say, an eagle to a dragon doesn't have more than 80 armor. If it gets caught by Dire Pack, we're smacking it for close to 40 weapon strength per attack. I believe it might actually be over 40 weapon strength per attack. And it can't rout them, unlike, say, normal dogs. Normal dogs, even Beasts of Tashnar, they can rout. They've only got Frenzy. They can get terror routed by a dragon if it stands and fights. Dire Pack is going to stay on it till the bitter end. They obviously won't win 1-1, but they can just pester that unit, keep it pinned to the ground for far longer than normal dogs would. Regiment around Vargas, I'm going to put them at the same spot as normal Vargas. They're Vargas who get Vanguard, which is neat. They also get Terror. Same issues I have with Vargas apply to these guys. They're basically what the Morngul Regiment around is to Mornguls. These guys are to Vargas. They're just a bit beefier or a bit better. And they get Vanguard, which opens up some slight opportunities to get sneaky flanks. But obviously being a flyer, it's hard to be sneaky. So C tier for me. Same reasons as Vargas, basically. Now, moving on to the most epic category, and that is, of course, carts and chariots. And, of course, starting with the most epicerest of chariots, Corpse Cart. For me, it is a B tier. I'm going to give it a low B. Cheap, expendable. Well, it's not expendable because undead are all expendable, but cheap. Provides a solid stat buff. +5/+5 is very respectable for any vampire count unit except maybe Blood Knights and like Vargolfs, Terra Geist, just because most of them do not have great combat stats. Even Graveguard combat stats are not particularly good. So Corpse Cart augments that very well. It has a decent HP pool while only costing 250. So if your opponent is wasting their time shooting this to death, or multiples of these to death, then they are, wasting their time. And it makes it a fairly reliable unit. Your opponent is either wasting all their energy killing a 250 gold support tool, but if they don't deal with it, your entire front line is fighting much better. They might be getting somewhere between 25% to 15% or so more melee attack. It's a pretty beefy buff, and plus 25% to 15% more melee defense. It's pretty insane what you get from a Corpse Cart. And so for me, it's an easy B tier. It's just very slow, and once again, like zombies, unlike zombies, this isn't really a tar pit. But unlike zombies, just like zombies, it's slow and slows your entire army down. And you do want it supporting some decent units. So if you want it supporting decent units, you got to be ready for your entire front line to be delayed. Balefire Corpse Cart, this one is going to get very low on the list. Nets itself I actually think it's a tiny bit better than the... Ooh, it's very low on the list. For me, maybe put it above Skeleton Warriors. Maybe that's a bit generous. I don't know. I did have some people point out that you can use it in certain blobby matchups to deny enemy wins with magic. That is fair. However, even in those matchups, I think this unit is very flimsy. To missile fire and getting the benefit can still be very, very difficult. Because you need to be in a position where there's multiple units being impacted to really get a major advantage from the Balefire effect. And a lot of times those blob fights will be happening between mobile units, which the Corpse Cart isn't able to reach. So I personally still don't think it's worth more than a D tier. I think it is a very, very niche unit. It can have its purpose in niches and in a niche like that, but ultimately it's difficult to justify, especially because your opponent will probably get at least their first 30 wins of magic before the Corpse Cart is even in a position to use the Balefire effect. And it's entirely possible they'll even get more wins of magic before it's used its effect. Moving on to the Lodestone, this one I think is much more respectable. I think a very, very solid Corpse Cart. Once again, it gets itself an easy A tier. Same reasons as the normal Corpse Cart, except it heals, so it's even more of a priority target. It costs 500 instead of 250, so a bit more justifiable to shoot it, but still very, very cheap. Instead of a Crypt Ghoul, you get an AoE heal and stat buff, which is nice. It's a good buff. The only downside is that it's kind of pricey compared to the Necromancer version for what it brings. Necromancer gets actual combat stats and missile resist, which this boy does not, but otherwise Lodestone is not bad. And if you're great with cycle charging, of course, it can net all the kills with its excellent agility and high charge bonus. Black Coach, a decent unit, actually a pretty solid unit nowadays. I'm actually gonna give this one another low B. High charge bonus, not great weapon strength, but it does get a steady, and not great survivability, but it gets a steady boost of Roid Rage every time it stays in combat for 45 seconds. So if you stay in combat for 135 seconds, it gets pretty bonkers. You get Strider, you get fire damage, you get extra weapon strength, you get ward save up to 44%, if I remember correctly. So it's a unit that rewards good micro, and a unit that, when microed correctly, can net massive results. It does magic damage, one of the few units on the roster to do so, making it strong against ethereals. Or I should say one of the few units on the roster that does so without being vulnerable to magic themselves, making a good counter to enemy ethereals. Causes terror while being fairly cheap. Not the cheapest option for terror. You do have cheaper. You've got the Karen race, you've got the Banshee, but it's a very cheap source of terror. And all in all, just a solid chariot, but very much a true chariot. This is probably one of the most unforgiving chariots in the entire game, I would say, because if you slip up, it dies quick. Not the greatest leadership. It goes into crumbling pretty easy. Terrible armor at 60, which is one of the worst armors in the game, especially for a chariot in this price range. Because this is, keep in mind, while I did talk up how cheap it is, this is an 1100 gold chariot. So it's cheap, but it's cheap compared to other single entity chariots, like a noble chariot or a Tomb Prince chariot or its Doom Wheel or Steam Tank or something. It's cheap compared to those. But compared to a actual 3 model unit of chariots or a cheap heroic chariot like a Beastman Caster chariot, it's not that cheap. It's still an 1100 gold chariot. It's really paying for that terror and those sustained combat stats. So if your micro is not good, this unit instantly tanks down to an F tier. This unit will be trash. If you are an excellent player and you are on top of your micro, this unit could easily be an A or even S tier. Because it really is such a skill-dependent unit, and probably one of the more skill-dependent units in the entire game, I would say. Because it is really unforgiving with its terrible combat stats and terrible armor, but long-term reward. And the Terra calls it. It's just a very, very min-maxed unit. And I think that does mean that B is a pretty fair spot to put it in, because it's middle of the pack. Which does move us on to Mortise Engines. Basic Mortise Engine I don't really think is very good. Not because it's terrible, but because Clobbing Ash is just better, and you don't want more than one Mortise Engine. So you're basically never going to bring Mortise Engine. It's another unit that lands here down at the bottom of the barrel, basically because it's redundant. Whereas the Clobbing Ash, in my mind, can net itself an easy. It's gotten a bit less, I would say, meta with the nerfs to Mortise Engines, buffs to some of the opposition. But I still think it is a easy B tier. Yeah, I think an easy B tier. probably mid-range in the B tier. It can dominate certain matchups. It can still be great against Chaos, still great against Beastmen. And for just being so dominating in those matchups, I'm going to give it a high B. Actually, I'm going to put it at top B tier here. But it's obviously very vulnerable to missile fire. It is, if it gets caught in melee, it dies very, very quickly. It's fairly expensive at 1700. It does have some great buffs to nearby units, healing nearby units, providing constant winds of magic regen, and of course the degen aura. So all in all, very, very strong abilities. Not great in combat, but can do some damage in combat with its melee attacks. But a B tier unit, I think, for the Claw of Nagash. It's definitely fallen out of favor with some of the changes to Graveguard and Terra Geist and new Lord editions. I think counts have gotten some alternate options that they used to not have in certain matchups. In matchups where the Mortise used to be the deciding factor. And at the same time, the Mortise is just continues to be a liability or a bit of a easy pick in several other matchups. So for me, it's going to net itself a B tier. Whereas normal Mortise is just a D tier. It's if you can't afford a Claw of Nagash, you bring a Mortise engine. Maybe if you're trying to save 300 gold for some specific unit. But really, it's the lack of magic resistance does make this a bit more vulnerable to fireballs, which are a very common way to counter it, or fire missiles in general. And the lack of chilling aura makes this unit way more vulnerable in melee. Goon squads suddenly become much more of a threat to this unit because off the top of my head, you've got 48 speed, and that means that suddenly a character on a horse, for example, even a slow horse like a barded horse with 66 speed or whatever, is a serious threat. Throw in the Claw of Nagash's 36% chilling aura, and that character can't catch you. And even flyers, a lot of flyers, they have a slower speed when they're on the ground level, so suddenly they can't catch something like the Claw of Nagash. It makes it a very, very valuable unit, and yeah, it's one of the reasons that Mortise Engine here just nets itself a D tier. That is it for my Vampire Count tier list. I do hope you guys enjoyed. As usual, feel free to share your thoughts, opinions, comments, and critiques down below. I will do my best to respond as soon as I can. If you disagree, agree, definitely let me know. And if you've got other use cases or other suggestions on where these units might be valuable, certainly say so. So I do thank you all for watching. Hope you all enjoyed. Looking forward to any more news we might be getting on those latest leaks CA has been dumping on us. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.